The main question, everyone already understands that the negotiations are starting to hit a dead end. A stalemate, right? Everyone already realizes that Russia is trolling more than actually trying to negotiate or resolve anything. How do you see the next 6 months? What developments do you expect in the near future?
Yes, these negotiations were doomed from the very beginning, because these weren't really negotiations, but rather a farce. It was an attempt to strike a deal between Trump and Putin. That's why Trump's negotiators were his son-in-law and a business partner, not Rubio. And on the Russian side, it wasn't even Lavrov, but Dmitriev, as they say, Putin's wallet. So it was about an attempt to sell part of Ukraine to Putin for very specific benefits. And it's no coincidence that in those first 28 points, there was a provision stating that de facto, Kushner and Vekselberg would gain control over the frozen Russian assets. Basically, Trump did everything as if he handed it all to Putin. He gave him carte blanche to win the war. Essentially, it's clear that America was only engaged in sabotage. Under Trump, there were grand statements, but overall, Trump tried to force Ukraine to accept catastrophic terms as a loser. Once again, Ukraine stood up against all expectations. And as of today, Trump has nothing to offer. Because for Putin, the war has already become a way to sustain his regime. The regime cannot exist without war. It's like a drug. And the dose needs to be increased. Therefore, in principle, if you look at what Russian propaganda is saying and what Putin himself and his inner circle are saying, there are no indicators at all that the war could end tomorrow. We're not even talking about ending the war, but about a ceasefire. Any cessation of hostilities would mean that Putin would have to address the issue of what to do with the army. Where should he put it? That's 1 million people, most of them drug addicts, murderers, people who have already gotten used to a completely different way of life. If you bring them back to Russia, we can see what happens even when just a few thousand return. There's a sharp rise in crime, and in reality, it creates tremendous tension in society. 1 million people, never in a lifetime. This means that Putin has to look for other targets for war. Most likely, these will be the Baltic countries. In other words, the war will continue as long as Putin has the resources to keep it going. And that's why even the unlikely scenario of a ceasefire in Ukraine this year means that the war will somehow spread further. Europe is gradually beginning to realize that Putin means war. It's an equation sign. And as long as he remains in power, as long as he has resources, he will continue this war. And this war isn't just with Ukraine. Ukraine is his main target right now. If you listen to what Putin and his propaganda are saying, this is a war with Europe, with NATO, and really with the free world as a whole. Basically, for Putin, this is like a fourth world war. The third world war was the Cold War, which the USSR, the Russian Empire, lost. Now, Putin is trying to take revenge and return us to that very world where, as they say, might is always right. And Ukraine has completely disproved all these calculations. And that's why, as of today, I don't expect any real ceasefire unless Putin... Serious problems for Russia, which, in my opinion, can no longer be ruled out.
What do you mean by serious problems? So what could be the alternative? We all understand that Trump is also trying to push the allies away from Russia somehow. So how else could it be?
First of all, Russia depends on China. China is the key factor in Russia's ability to continue the war. Putin's problems in Russia come in two types. The first problem is financial. In reality, the financial situation is getting worse. That is, the time when money could be spent endlessly is already in the past. It's clear that there are problems with contract soldiers because there isn't enough money for everything. They have to economize in order to maintain the loyalty of the entire regime, the whole vertical of power, or just to have enough money. This is the corruption component. Plus, there's a huge amount of unproductive labor because the apparatus, the repressive apparatus, requires spending and ever-increasing spending at that. The worse the situation in the country gets, the more money has to be given to the enforcers who prop up the regime and are supposed to keep it under control. That's the financial problem. The second problem, in fact, is the potential and growing rift between the repressive apparatus and the business community. Many people who are not directly involved in the renewal of the state. The wall of experience cannot be completely closed off. Finances, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Kazakhstan, China. In principle, Russia needs to maintain some connection with the outside world because that's where the money flows come from. And here again, a conflict arises. On the one hand, there's a desire to shut everything down, but on the other hand, there's a need to keep these contacts because otherwise there won't be resources to support the regime. It creates a kind of closed loop. Moreover, there's an attempt to cut off all contacts with the outside world, electronic ones. This also met with resistance. What happened just a few days ago in the Russian State Duma, a puppet organization that has never even hinted at any contradictions about any kind of disagreements. 77 State Duma deputies voted against slowing down Telegram. Again, it's absolutely clear that this gap is emerging. Because what are the soldiers in the trenches supposed to do? Because Telegram has already become a part of life. In other words, in reality, that's what it is. The 21st century, it's 1926. After all, it makes its own adjustments to Putin's plans to return Russia to the past, the beginning of the 19th century. That's why these problems need to be addressed. And most importantly, it seems to me that in the minds of people in Russia, if you listen to the commentary, read Telegram channels, the question arises, can Putin actually win the war? And in Russian history, this always repeats itself. A good war, in quotes, a good war, a war that is won regardless of the cost, means the regime is strengthened. History shows that any military conflict that goes wrong or a war that is ultimately lost almost always leads to widespread social upheaval, deep unrest, or even a full-scale revolution. Putin's regime is currently finding itself in a very unstable and precarious situation, especially now when many people across Russia are starting to seriously wonder exactly how much longer they will be forced to keep fighting this war. If these trends begin to grow increasingly more intense, both in financial terms and psychological aspects, connected with contacts with the broader world outside of our immediate borders, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that when these various vectors converge, 2026 could become a very pivotal and highly significant turning point in the war, and then once again a collapse could occur. It seems to me that this war is so unusual if you compare it to traditional wars. A Ukrainian victory might turn out to be a psychological victory at first. There's no need to chase Putin's army all over the territory of Ukraine. It could turn out to be a collapse that makes it impossible for Putin to continue the war. Although, again, for now, these are just fantasies that we're all trying to turn into reality.
It's interesting, in your view of such a more concrete collapse, what might it look like?
It's simple. Right now, we see that Starlink has been shut off and a retreat has begun along the front lines. Collapse can be psychological, just like Germany lost World War I. In fact, they lost World War I while still being on foreign territory. The army. So what happens is a breakdown of these connections, so to speak. The army clearly cannot win the war. The population doesn't want to support it. So it's a combination of several crises. And at the same time, there's also the external issue to consider. As long as the Putin regime maintains confidence or hope that Trump will somehow help them. Let's imagine a situation where Trump loses his levers of control. At the end of 2026, the Democrats could take Congress and the Senate, and the situation could change. So the situation is unstable, and just look at Europe. Europe is starting to arm itself. In fact, even that very pampered, decadent Europe is starting basically to realize that this war actually concerns them too. There are big debates, as they say, and I participate in them too. It's the same thing here, the same discussion models. This is the issue of rearming Europe. And it's clear that this isn't about Europe as a whole. Yes, obviously there's Spain, Portugal, France. This is about Europe, Germany, and everything that stems from it. In other words, a new geopolitical reality is beginning to take shape, in which Russia is seen as a real enemy. And if all this starts to work, if hundreds of billions of euros begin to flow into armaments, once again changing the psychological state, the mindset, then it's clear that the coalition of Germany, Poland, the Baltic states, Scandinavia, Ukraine, and Romania, I hope that Hungary will soon join as well, even if it means chasing Orban out. This, in fact, will be a death sentence for the Russian Empire.